The colony of Kepler's Hope had never been a particularly glamorous place to live. Nestled between two jagged mountain ranges on the third moon of Kepler 442b, it was the kind of settlement that appeared on star maps as a tiny blue dot, barely worth noting unless you were specifically searching for it. 11,243 people called it home. Miners, mostly, along with engineers, hydroponics farmers, a handful of teachers, 2 doctors, and one rather overworked veterinarian who spent most of his days tending to the livestock herds that roamed the pressurized agricultural domes on the colony's eastern edge. There were children who had never seen Earth, who knew only this cold, windswept moon with its burnt orange skies and its twin moons that hung like ancient lanterns in the perpetual dusk. They had built schools here. They had built libraries. They had built small parks where genetically adapted grass grew in careful, stubborn patches, and where parents pushed strollers along winding paths while discussing the mundane concerns of small-town life. They had built a life. That life ended on a Tuesday morning. No one on Kepler's Hope knew exactly what the Vorkai were. The alien species had been making their presence known on the outer edges of human-explored space for approximately 3 years before the attack, but their encounters with humanity had been limited to brief, unsettling confrontations near asteroid mining operations, a few destroyed unmanned probes, and one catastrophic incident involving a deep space research vessel called the Meridian that had gone silent and never returned. The United Earth Defense Council had classified the Vorkai as a Category 3 threat, which in bureaucratic language meant they were being watched carefully, negotiated with cautiously, and prepared for diplomatically. Category 3 did not mean war. Category 3 meant committees, and reports, and slow-moving diplomatic overtures that traveled across light years at the pace of careful political deliberation. It meant that Kepler's Hope, 11,000 miles from the nearest military installation, had a single defensive satellite array of aging design, a colonial militia of roughly 400 men and women equipped with standard-issue rifles and 2 atmospheric fighter craft that had last been serviced 18 months ago. What descended on Kepler's Hope on that Tuesday morning was not a diplomatic overture. Governor Elaine Marsh was reviewing agricultural output reports in her office when the emergency broadcast system screamed to life. She had heard that sound once before during a simulation drill 3 years earlier, and even then, the sharp, electronic wail of it had raised every hair on her arms. Now, in the amber light of the early morning, with her coffee still steaming on her desk and through her window the sight of miners beginning their day shift beneath the orange sky, the sound was something altogether different. It was the sound of the world ending. She was on her feet and moving toward the communications console before the second cycle of the alarm had finished, pulling up the tactical display with fingers that were steady through pure professional discipline, though her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. The display showed her everything and told her nothing useful. 17 contacts. 17 separate contacts entering the moon's upper atmosphere on a trajectory that the system's targeting algorithm immediately classified as aggressive. They were not ships she recognized. They were not any configuration that appeared in the Colonial Defense Database. They were angular, brutal things, shaped like broken arrowheads, trailing plasma as they cut through the thin upper atmosphere with a speed that suggested they did not particularly care about aerodynamics or the heat of atmospheric entry. The colony's single defensive satellite array had already begun cycling its targeting systems, and the tactical display showed that 2 of the satellites had opened fire. The display then showed both satellites going dark within 6 seconds of each other. "Get me Commander Reyes," she said to her communications officer, who was already frantically working the console beside her. "Get me Colonel Whitford at Proxima Station. Get me anyone with guns." She paused, staring at the display, watching the 17 contacts descend with terrible, mechanical precision toward her colony. "And get an emergency broadcast to Earth. Priority 1. Tell them what is happening. Tell them everything." The first strike hit the power distribution hub on the colony's northern perimeter. The explosion was visible from every dome in the settlement, a column of fire and superheated atmosphere that climbed 300 meters into the orange sky before the wind caught it and tore it sideways. 3 seconds later, the colony's primary power grid went down in a cascade failure that plunged the residential sectors into emergency lighting, and then, before anyone had truly processed what was happening, the Vorkai ground troops arrived. They came down in drop pods that struck the colony's exterior plating like hammers, each one punching through the surface and deploying its payload of soldiers with a mechanical efficiency that was almost admirable in its brutality. 11 pods. 11 separate entry points across the colony's outer shell. 11 holes punched through the careful, hard-won infrastructure that 11,000 people depended on to survive in an environment that would kill an unprotected human in approximately 3 minutes. The Vorkai themselves were a sight that no amount of theoretical briefing documents could have adequately prepared anyone for. They stood between 8 and 9 feet tall, with bodies that appeared to be naturally armored in overlapping plates of dense, chitinous material that ranged in color from deep charcoal to mottled gray-green, like the carapace of something that had evolved in a world where everything was trying to kill it. They moved with a fluid, four-limbed grace that was deeply unsettling on something of their size, their secondary arms folded against their torsos in resting position while their primary arms carried weapons that fired coherent energy packets in rapid, controlled bursts. They did not shout. They did not make the sounds one might expect from a conquering force. They communicated in rapid subsonic pulses that human ears perceived as a faint, unnerving vibration in the chest, and they moved through the corridors and passages of Kepler's hope with the calm, unhurried confidence of a force that had done this before. Commander Reyes had the militia mobilized in 11 minutes. This was, by any military standard, an extraordinary achievement under circumstances of complete surprise, and it saved perhaps 100 lives, though no one would count the exact number until much later. She had 162 people formed into defensive positions around the residential sectors before the Vorkai advance reached the central hub, and she had managed to get both atmospheric fighters airborne, though one of them took a direct hit from the second wave of Vorkai air support while still climbing and went down in a spiral of burning wreckage over the eastern agricultural domes. The pilot's name was Lieutenant Carla Huang, and she was 26 years old, and she had grown up on Kepler's Hope, and she had wanted to fly since she was 4 years old. The colony's remaining fighter, piloted by Sergeant Domingo Vasquez, managed to destroy one Vorkai dropship and damage a second before being forced to land due to structural damage from weapons fire he had never seen before and could not have predicted or defended against. Governor Marsh coordinated the evacuation from the emergency command center beneath the colony's administration building, a reinforced space that had been built with geological disasters in mind rather than military assault, but which proved adequate to its repurposed function for the first critical hours of the attack. She directed families to the emergency shelters in the deep mining tunnels beneath the moon's surface, moving people through maintenance corridors and service tunnels while the sounds of combat rolled through the colony above them like thunder. She was calm in a way that would later be described by survivors as almost supernatural, her voice steady on the emergency broadcast system as she directed traffic in a life-or-death evacuation, naming specific routes, identifying specific hazards, speaking with the measured authority of someone who had decided, in some fundamental and unshakable way, that panic was a luxury she could not afford. 8,911 people made it to the deep shelters. They brought what they could carry, which was mostly children and fear and the kind of grim determination that humans have demonstrated in dark places throughout the entirety of their history on whatever rock they happened to be standing on. Down in the mining tunnels, 300 meters below the surface of the moon, in passages lit by emergency strips of pale blue light, parents held their children and told them it would be all right in voices that shook only slightly, and elderly miners who had spent 30 years learning the bones of this moon sat quietly and planned, because men and women who work underground know that patience and knowledge of the terrain are worth more than almost anything else when the world above has become dangerous. 2,332 people did not make it to the shelters. The Vorkai occupied the colony's surface structures within 4 hours of the initial assault. They were thorough and methodical in a way that spoke of long experience with this particular kind of operation, and they moved through the corridors and domes of Kepler's Hope with a systematic efficiency that stripped the colony of everything useful to them with the same indifferent precision with which one might harvest a field. They took the colony's stored fuel reserves. They took the rare earth mineral stockpiles from the mining operations processing facility, 3 months of excavation work piled in neatly labeled containers that represented the primary economic output of 11,000 people's labor. They took the colony's long-range communication array and dismantled it with practiced speed, leaving Kepler's Hope cut off from the outside universe as effectively as if someone had simply switched off the stars. They were not wanton in their destruction. They were not burning things for the pleasure of burning. They were conducting what appeared to be a military and economic operation with specific, predetermined objectives, and this in some ways was more terrifying than simple rage would have been, because it implied something far more troubling than hatred. It implied a plan. Down in the tunnels, Governor Marsh's emergency transmitter, a short-range device built into the geology survey equipment and never intended for anything more dramatic than reporting mineral surveys to orbital platforms, was already broadcasting its desperate, compressed signal into the dark between the stars. It was a simple message, because the situation required no ornamentation. It contained their coordinates, their status, the nature of the attackers, and the specific, clear, unambiguous statement that Kepler's Hope was under military assault by a non-human species. The signal was weak, bouncing off the mineral-dense rock of the moon's mantle in ways that complicated its transmission, traveling outward into space in a cone that might or might not intersect with anything capable of receiving it. She broadcast it every 4 hours, on the hour, and between broadcasts she organized her people with the efficiency of someone who understood that survival is fundamentally an act of collective will. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, 8,911 people lived in tunnels with limited food, carefully rationed water from the underground aquifers that the mining operation had tapped years ago, and air that grew progressively staler despite the best efforts of the tunnel's ventilation systems, which were running on backup power cells that would last perhaps another week. There were 4 deaths from medical conditions that proper medical equipment would have managed without difficulty. There were 2 births, one of which went dangerously wrong before the colony's senior doctor, who had been with the evacuation group, managed to stabilize the situation. The children were kept as calm as possible through storytelling and games and the extraordinary, instinctive capacity of small humans to adapt to circumstances that would break many adults. The adults took shifts at the security checkpoints, armed with mining equipment and the few weapons that had made it into the tunnels, watching the tunnel entrances with the focused attention of people who understood exactly what it meant if those entrances were breached. Commander Reyes used the 3 days to organize something that she would later, with characteristic understatement, refer to as a nuisance campaign. With 67 militia members who had armed themselves with a combination of standard weapons and improvised devices constructed from mining equipment, she conducted a series of raids on Vorkai positions in the colony's maintenance corridors so narrow and labyrinthine that the physical size of the Vorkai became a disadvantage rather than an asset. These raids were not intended to recapture the colony. She was not naive enough to believe that 67 people with modified drilling equipment could defeat a professional military force of apparently superior technology. The raids were intended to make the Vorkai pay a cost for every hour they spent on Kepler's Hope, to communicate the simple and fundamental message that the people of this colony were not passive, were not finished, were not going to quietly accept what was being done to them. 3 Vorkai were killed in these operations. 11 militia members were wounded. None were killed, a statistical miracle that Reyes attributed to the terrain advantage, the element of surprise, and what she privately considered the sheer, bloody-minded refusal of her people to die easily. On the 4th day, the signal arrived at Proxima Station. Captain James Adler of the UED heavy cruiser Resolute was in the middle of a routine patrol briefing when the communications officer interrupted with the expression that experienced military personnel learned to recognize immediately, the expression of someone who has received information that has changed the nature of everything. He read the transcript of Kepler's Hope's emergency signal twice, very quickly, and then looked up at his senior staff and said 4 words that would later be quoted in approximately 47 different historical accounts of what followed. "Sound general quarters," he said. Now. The Resolute was a Cerberus-class heavy cruiser, one of 11 in active service with the United Earth Defense Force, and she was perhaps the most beautiful thing that human engineering had yet produced, which was an aesthetic judgment that was also and simultaneously a tactical one. She was 680 meters of reinforced hull and layered electromagnetic shielding, carrying a complement of 2,200 crew members, 48 fighter craft of the newest Sabre 4 configuration, and a weapons loadout that military procurement committees described in technical language but which sailors described more simply and accurately as enough to make a planet think twice. She had been designed in the aftermath of the Meridian incident, when someone in the UED's planning division had finally, soberly, looked at the available evidence and concluded that humanity was going to need warships. Real warships. Not the patrol vessels and customs enforcement craft that had constituted the fleet before, but purpose-built instruments of organized military violence capable of projecting lethal force across astronomical distances against an enemy of unknown but demonstrably significant capability. Captain Adler opened a communication channel to UED Command at Proxima Station, reported the situation in precise, factual terms, and simultaneously issued orders that put the Resolute on an intercept course to Kepler's Hope at maximum sustainable drive output. He did not wait for authorization to move, and when that authorization arrived, 17 minutes later, along with orders to assess the situation and report from a committee that was clearly still processing the implications of what it had received, Adler sent back a response that was 3 sentences long in which his communications officer later admitted she had considered not transmitting because it seemed insubordinate. It was not insubordinate. It was simply clear. "Assessment complete," he wrote. "Our people are under attack. We are responding." The Resolute's drive signature, blazing at full military thrust, was visible to the passive sensor arrays on 3 different observation platforms across the sector. Other ships saw it. Station commanders and patrol captains across a significant volume of human-explored space watched the Resolute light up their displays like a comet and drew their own conclusions about what it meant, and those conclusions led to communication channels being opened, to questions being asked, to answers being given, and to drives being ignited across distances that the speed of light crossed in minutes but that human ships took hours and days to travel. The word spread, and with the word spread something else, something that passed through the communications network of humanity's scattered colonies and stations and ships like a current through water, something that was not quite anger and not quite fear but was instead something older and more fundamental than either. When a species that has spent its entire history learning to survive hostile environments, that has clawed its way through ice ages and pandemics and wars of extinction and the crushing indifference of an uncaring cosmos, is told that someone has attacked one of its families, something wakes up in it. Something that civilized behavior and diplomatic frameworks and careful political reasoning usually keeps quiet, keeps managed, keeps channeled into appropriate and constructive forms. It woke up now, in the crews of ships across the sector, in the officers and admirals at Proxima Station who began flooding the UED command network with requests for orders, in the politicians and defense council members on Earth who were pulled out of their Tuesday morning routines and handed briefings that made the implications unmistakably clear. It woke up in the voice of the President of the United Earth Territories, who stood before an emergency session of the Defense Council approximately 18 hours after the Kepler's Hope signal was received and delivered a statement that was subsequently broadcast to every colony, station, and vessel in human space, a statement notable not for its length or its rhetoric but for the absolute, quiet certainty with which it was delivered. 11,000 of our people are under attack on Kepler's Hope, she said. Our response will be proportionate. Our response will be complete. Our response will demonstrate, with clarity sufficient to require no further elaboration, that an attack on any human settlement, anywhere in explored space, by any party, will be answered with the full and total weight of everything humanity is capable of bringing to bear. We did not seek this conflict. We will finish it. On Kepler's Hope, 5 days into the occupation, Governor Marsh was conducting her 4th daily headcount in the tunnels when her geology survey transmitter, which she had never stopped broadcasting from, received a response. Not a full message. Not a voice communication. Just a signal, a precise, military-formatted acknowledgement code that told her, in the language that UED vessels used to confirm receipt of distress signals, that someone had heard them. She stared at the small screen of the survey device for a long moment, in the pale blue emergency lighting of the tunnel, surrounded by 8,000 people who were depending on her, and she read the code twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. Then she walked to the center of the tunnel where most of her people could see her, and she said, in a voice that carried clearly through the underground silence, "They're coming." The silence that followed was not the silence of people who had given up. It was the silence of people hearing news so important that they needed a moment to let it settle through them completely, to let it reach all the places that 5 days of cold and fear and uncertainty had made vulnerable, to fill those places with something warm. And then it broke, not dramatically, not with cheering exactly, but with a sound that was perhaps more powerful than cheering, the sound of thousands of people exhaling simultaneously, the sound of held breath released, the sound of humans who had been surviving now understanding that they were going to live. Commander Reyes, who had been standing beside the governor, looked at the acknowledgement code on the survey device screen, then looked up at the tunnel ceiling above them, through the 300 meters of rock and moon crust and occupied colony infrastructure between them and the orange sky, toward the stars that she could not see but knew were there. She allowed herself 3 seconds of something that might have been relief. Then she turned to her second-in-command and said, "Tell everyone on patrol to step up the nuisance operations. If the fleet is coming, I want the Vorkai to have their hands completely full before the first ship drops out of drive." Her second-in-command, a former mining foreman named Takeshi Yamamoto who had never in his previous professional life imagined that he would be conducting guerrilla warfare operations against an alien military force in the service corridors of his home colony, looked at her with an expression that combined profound respect with the particular kind of resigned amusement that people develop when they have accepted their circumstances and decided to make the absolute most of them. "How much fuller can we make their hands?" he asked. "I have ideas," Reyes said. She did have ideas. They were the kind of ideas that occur to people who know every centimeter of the terrain they are fighting in, who understand the structural systems of their environment at an intimate level, who have 3 days of careful observation of an enemy's patrol patterns and response times and the specific limitations imposed on a large, physically powerful species by corridors designed for humans of standard dimensions. They were the kind of ideas that, when she laid them out over the next hour on a hand-drawn map scratched in the rock dust of the tunnel floor, made Yamamoto's eyebrows rise steadily upward until they disappeared beneath his hairline. The Vorkai had made a mistake in their careful, methodical, militarily professional assault on Kepler's Hope. It was not a mistake of tactics. It was not a mistake of strategy. It was a more fundamental error than either of those things, the kind of error that is made when a species has never encountered humans in their natural state, which is to say, when a species has underestimated precisely what it means to attack something that belongs to a people who have been surviving impossible situations for the entirety of their existence. They had left the humans alive. They had done it for their own reasons, and they had done it efficiently and without cruelty, as though the survival of the colonists was simply an irrelevant variable in their calculations, something that neither helped nor harmed their operation and therefore required no specific action. They had not understood that 11,000 humans in a tunnel, with time to think and plan and remember what they were not an irrelevant variable. They were a weapon waiting to be aimed. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, traveling at the maximum output of the most powerful military drives that human engineering could produce, the hand that intended to aim that weapon was coming. The Vorkai commander designated in military translation as Claw of Broken Sky had conducted 17 planetary and orbital assault operations across 4 different star systems in his career, and he had never once lost a secured objective after initial capture. This was a record he was justifiably proud of, built on a foundation of meticulous planning, superior firepower, and the fundamental tactical principle that had guided Vorkai military doctrine for 3 centuries, which was simply this: establish dominance so complete and so immediately overwhelming that resistance becomes psychologically impossible before it can become physically organized. It was a principle that had worked with extraordinary consistency against every species the Vorkai had encountered in their expansion across this region of the galaxy, species that had looked at the math of the situation and made the rational calculation that organized resistance was futile, that survival required accommodation, that the cost of defiance was higher than any reasonable species would willingly pay. He had, on the 5th day of the Kepler's Hope operation, begun to suspect that humans were not a reasonable species. It had started small. Patrol units returning to base with equipment malfunctions that engineering analysis traced to precise, deliberate interference with specific system components, interference that required detailed technical knowledge of Vorkai hardware that no human should have possessed. Then 2 members of his secondary assault squad reported contact with human fighters in Corridor Section 7, a section that should have been completely cleared and secured, and came back without the patrol commander, who was found 3 hours later in a maintenance access shaft with injuries consistent with having been struck repeatedly by something with considerable mechanical force at a precise anatomical targeting point that implied knowledge of Vorkai physiology that was, frankly, alarming. Then the colonial fuel processing system, which his engineers had been preparing to transfer to the extraction vessels, suffered a catastrophic control failure that his technical analysts eventually determined had been caused by a modification to the management software so elegant and so precisely targeted that his lead engineer had spent 4 hours examining it with something very close to professional admiration before remembering that she was supposed to be appalled. Clove Broken Sky called a command briefing on the morning of the 6th day and listened to his department heads report a situation that was technically still under control and was simultaneously and unmistakably deteriorating in ways that did not fit his operational models. His security chief reported 17 separate incidents of contact with human fighters operating in the colony's maintenance and service corridor network, a network so complex and so thoroughly built into the structure of the colony that his forces would need to dedicate 3 times their current security complement just to monitor it adequately, let alone seal it. His engineering chief reported that the fuel transfer operation was delayed by approximately 40 hours due to the software interference, which could be corrected but which suggested that the humans below had access to technical expertise and operational information that a besieged civilian population had no business possessing. His intelligence officer, a precise and unsentimental individual named something that translated approximately as Stillwater Deep, reported that signal analysis of the colony's lower frequency bands suggested the humans had been broadcasting since the first day of the operation, and that while the signal was too weak to reach any significant UED installation directly, the possibility that it had been intercepted and relayed could not be definitively ruled out. Clove Broken Sky absorbed all of this in the focused, analytical silence that was his characteristic command style, asked 3 specific clarifying questions, and then made a decision that his intelligence officer would later, in testimony before a Vorkai military review board, describe as the moment when the operation's outcome became uncertain. He ordered the acceleration of the extraction timeline, reducing the planned operation from 12 days to 7, and he ordered a systematic search of the primary tunnel access points to locate and neutralize the human fighters operating in the maintenance corridors. He did not order an assault on the tunnel shelters themselves, both because the depth made it logistically complicated and because his operational parameters included a directive about civilian casualties that reflected Vorkai political considerations he was not free to disregard. He was, in other words, operating under constraints that his opponents below were not, and he was about to discover what that asymmetry meant when applied against people who had spent 5 days doing nothing except planning how to use it. Commander Reyes had been waiting for exactly this response. She had predicted it, not with certainty but with the confident probability estimate of someone who had spent 3 days studying her enemy's behavior patterns as carefully as she had ever studied anything in her life. When the Vorkai security response changed character on the morning of the 6th day, becoming more systematic and more concentrated around the primary tunnel access points, she recognized it immediately as the operational shift she had anticipated and prepared for, and she set in motion a sequence of actions that she had planned with Yamamoto and her 12 most experienced team leaders across the previous 40 hours with a level of collaborative tactical thinking that would have surprised Anyone who had known these people only as miners and logistics coordinators and hydroponics supervisors. The first element was the simplest. 3 teams of 4 militia members each, moving through secondary maintenance corridors that Reyes had specifically kept clear of any previous raiding activity, conducted simultaneous strikes on the Vorkai communication relay stations that the occupying force had established at 3 points along the colony's outer ring. These strikes were brief, precise, and specifically designed to damage rather than destroy, causing enough disruption to require the Vorkai to redirect technical resources without providing the kind of catastrophic failure that would prompt an overwhelming security response. The effect was to split the Vorkai security commander's attention in exactly the way Reyes wanted it split, drawing resources toward the outer ring while the main event she had planned was already beginning somewhere else entirely. The main event was the power systems. Kepler's Hope had been built, like all human colonies of its generation, with redundant power infrastructure distributed through the facility in a way designed to prevent any single point of failure from compromising the whole system. The Vorkai had correctly identified and controlled the primary power distribution hub, which was why the colony had been running on emergency systems since the first hour of the attack. What they had not identified, because it was not on any official colony schematic and existed because a creative engineering team had quietly added it during the colony's 3rd year of operation as an unofficial backup to the official backup, was a secondary power coupling buried in the geological survey station on the colony's western edge, connected to a geothermal tap that was technically classified as an experimental system and therefore appeared on no document that the Vorkai's intelligence assessment of the colony had included. The engineer who had designed and installed this system was named Petra Volkov, and she was currently sitting in the tunnel shelter 300 meters below the surface, and she had spent 5 days thinking about nothing except the specific sequence of actions required to bring it online remotely from the survey station's maintenance terminal, which was, as it happened, accessible through a crawl space off Corridor 9 that no being of Vorkai physical dimensions could navigate. She had explained this to Commander Reyes on the 2nd day, and Reyes had looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone receiving a gift they hadn't expected, and had immediately begun building a plan around it. On the morning of the 6th day, while the diversionary strikes on the outer ring were pulling Vorkai security attention in the wrong direction, Petra Volkov crawled through 40 meters of maintenance access passage in the dark with a handheld tablet and a small toolkit, reached the survey station maintenance terminal, and began the startup sequence for a geothermal power coupling that had never been officially activated and that the Vorkai had no reason to suspect existed. The sequence took 11 minutes. She spent those 11 minutes lying on her stomach in a crawl space, listening to the vibration of Vorkai patrol units moving through the corridor 8 meters above her, breathing slowly and deliberately and thinking about her daughter who was in the tunnels below and who was 7 years old and had asked her mother this morning to please come back. The power came online at 0847 hours, local colony time. The effect was immediate and significant. Every system in the colony that had been running on emergency backup cells suddenly had access to a power supply that, while not equivalent to the primary grid, was substantial enough to restore approximately 40% of normal functionality across the facility. Emergency doors that had been sealed by power failure cycled open. Ventilation systems that had been struggling on minimal capacity surged back to something approaching normal. Interior lighting in the maintenance corridor network, which had been dark except for emergency strips, came on fully. And the colony's internal communication system, which had been silent since the attack, came back online with a low chime that echoed through corridors and tunnels and shelters alike. Governor Marsh, who had been told to be ready at her emergency transmitter at exactly 0847 hours, was ready. The moment the internal communication system came online, she broadcast a coordinated message on 3 simultaneous channels, to every shelter, to every militia team in the corridors, and, using the now-restored communication array that Yamamoto's team had spent 2 nights quietly and partially reconnecting through secondary cable routes the Vorkai had not thought to monitor, outward into space. It was not a distress call this time. It was a status report, detailed and precise, containing the current position and estimated strength of every Vorkai unit in the colony, the status of their extraction operation, the condition of the colonists in the shelters, and a clear and specific request for tactical coordination. She had no way of knowing if anyone was close enough to receive it in time for the information to be useful. She broadcast it anyway, because Governor Elaine Marsh had made a decision on the first day of this crisis that she would operate at all times as though rescue was coming, because the alternative was to operate as though it was not, and that was an alternative she had no intention of accepting. The response came 40 seconds later, and it was not the cautious acknowledgement code she had received 5 days earlier. It was a voice communication, clear and direct, from a source that identified itself as UED Cruiser Resolute, Captain James Adler commanding, currently at a distance that her communications officer converted from military notation to plain language and then had to read twice before he reported it to the governor, because the number seemed impossibly, wonderfully small. "Governor Marsh," Captain Adler's voice said, with the calm precision of someone who had been in situations of significant consequence before and had developed the habit of not wasting words when clarity was more useful than eloquence. "We have your transmission. We have your positional data. We have 12 ships in formation and 2 more coming. We will be in standard engagement range in 40 minutes. Can you hold 40 minutes? Governor Marsh looked at Commander Reyes, who was standing beside her with the colony's hand-drawn tactical map rolled under one arm and an expression that suggested she had already calculated the answer to this question before it was asked. "Tell him yes," Reyes said. "And tell him we have a gift for him. Tell him we know exactly where every Vorkai unit on this colony is positioned, and we will have the majority of them looking the wrong direction when he arrives." The governor looked at her for a moment. "Can we actually do that?" "We've been preparing to do that for 2 days, Reyes said. "I was just waiting for someone to give us a reason to start." What followed in the next 37 minutes was the kind of operation that gets studied in military academies not because of its scale, which was objectively small, but because of its elegance, the product of people who understood their environment completely, had planned with meticulous care, and executed with the kind of focused, collective determination that emerges when people are fighting for something that matters to them in the most fundamental way possible. Reyes deployed every militia member she had in a coordinated series of actions through the maintenance corridor network, using the restored internal communications to synchronize movements with a precision that had been impossible in the radio silence of the previous days. Teams that had been conducting independent nuisance raids coalesced into something more structured, more deliberate, striking at specific Vorkai positions in a sequence designed not to defeat the occupying force but to move it, to push it through pressure and response toward the northern processing sectors, away from the colony's main airlocks and landing pads, concentrating it into the section of the facility where Reyes wanted it to be when the fleet arrived. The Vorkai responded to these coordinated strikes with professional competence, which was exactly what Reyes had planned for. A competent response to a multi-point coordinated engagement means consolidating forces, establishing defensive perimeters, and calling for any available reserve support, and each of these competent responses moved the Vorkai precisely where the militia wanted them. Claw of Broken Sky, responding to reports of escalating human military activity across multiple sectors simultaneously, made the correct tactical decision to consolidate his forces in a defensible position, which happened to be the position that Commander Reyes had spent 2 days carefully and quietly preparing to be as disadvantageous as possible when the time came. He was still issuing consolidation orders when his long-range sensors reported multiple drive signatures dropping out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the system. 12 signatures. Then 14, as the last 2 ships that Adler had mentioned arrived on schedule. Then, over the next 6 minutes, for more, because the UED command had been somewhat more decisive in its response than Captain Adler had been officially authorized to promise, and because the admirals at Proxima Station had looked at the situation, looked at their available assets, and had quietly decided that the official response was going to be somewhat larger than the political response, at least until the politicians caught up. 18 ships. For heavy cruisers of the Cerberus class, 6 destroyers of the newer Warhound configuration, 3 carrier vessels each holding between 40 and 60 fighter craft, and 5 support vessels that carried among their cargo the kind of equipment that is required when you intend not just to win an engagement but to establish, with physical and unmistakable clarity, the full extent of what you are capable of. The formation that dropped into system was not the response of a government that had decided to send a strongly worded message. It was the response of a species that had heard what had been done to its people and had decided that the response should be legible to anyone, anywhere in explored space, who might be paying attention. Captain Adler's opening communication to the Vorkai fleet in orbit above Kepler's Hope was, like the man himself, notable for its efficiency. He identified his vessel, identified his authority, stated the facts of the situation as he understood them, and made a single demand that was stated with the clarity of someone who wanted there to be absolutely no possibility of misunderstanding. The Vorkai orbital elements, for vessels of varying class, were to stand down and withdraw from the system immediately. Any Vorkai ground forces were to cease operations and surrender to colonial militia authority. Any interference with the UED formation's movement or operations would be responded to with the full weapons capacity of 18 combat vessels. He gave a response window of 3 minutes, which was, in the mathematics of interstellar diplomatic communication, an extraordinarily short window, and which was specifically intended to be so, because he was not conducting a negotiation. He was stating the terms of an ending. The Vorkai orbital commander had exactly the sensor data that Adler wanted him to have, because the 18-ship UED formation had made no effort whatsoever to mask its drive signatures, its weapons charging status, or the emissions from 3,800 fighter craft cycling through pre-launch preparation in carrier bays. This transparency was a message in itself, the message that Adler and his commanding admiral had agreed upon before the fleet departed, which was simply that they were not trying to win through surprise or deception. They were trying to make a point. 2 of the 4 Vorkai orbital vessels began powering up drives within 90 seconds of Adler's communication. The other 2 followed within the 3-minute window. This was not cowardice. It was the calculation of a commander who looked at 18 human warships and understood that what he was looking at was not the beginning of a battle but the consequence of a mistake, and that the operational intelligence value of surviving to report what he had seen was greater than any tactical objective the engagement could possibly achieve. The Vorkai orbital commander was, in fact, an excellent military officer who simply had the misfortune of being the first of his species to discover, in direct personal terms, what happened when humanity decided it was done being patient. On the ground, the moment the restored communication system carried Captain Adler's signal to every active terminal in the colony, Commander Reyes received confirmation that the fleet was in engagement position, and she made a decision that she had been holding in reserve, a decision about a set of actions she had prepared but not yet deployed because they required a specific trigger, the knowledge that overwhelming force was about to arrive above and that the Vorkai ground units were about to know it too. She looked at Yamamoto and at her 12 team leaders assembled around the hand-drawn map in Corridor 9, and she said, in the quiet, matter-of-fact tone that had become her characteristic mode of command over the preceding 6 days, "Now, what happened in the next 12 minutes in the northern processing sectors of Kepler's Hope was something that Vorkai military analysts would spend considerable time trying to reconstruct from the partial records that survived, and that they would ultimately classify in their reports under a category that translated roughly as environmental manipulation at scale, which was accurate but which failed to capture what it had actually looked like from inside. Reyes had spent 2 days identifying every automated system in the northern processing sector that could be controlled through the restored internal network, and she had spent those 2 days preparing those systems to respond to a single command sequence in a specific, coordinated, precisely timed cascade. Pressure valves in the ore processing equipment. Ventilation cycling systems in the sector's environmental controls. Automated materials handling equipment that moved ore containers through the processing facility on tracked systems. Interior barrier doors throughout the sector's layout. Every one of these things was, individually, a mundane piece of industrial infrastructure with no particular offensive capability. Coordinated and triggered simultaneously, in a specific sequence that Reyes had worked out with engineering expertise she had borrowed from Petra Volkov and 3 senior mining engineers who had spent their careers understanding exactly what these systems could do under unusual operating conditions, they became something considerably less mundane. The Vorkai consolidated position in the northern processing sector found itself in an environment that had suddenly changed its characteristics in approximately 30 different ways at once, and while none of those changes were, individually, catastrophic, the combined effect of navigating a rapidly shifting industrial environment while simultaneously receiving notification that 18 enemy warships were in orbit above them and that the orbital support they had been relying on was departing the system was, from a command and control perspective, precisely as disruptive as Reyes had planned it to be. Clove Broken Sky made the assessment call within 4 minutes. His orbital support was gone. His extraction timeline was compromised. His forces were engaged across multiple sectors of a facility that the human defenders knew far better than he did, in physical conditions that were deteriorating in ways his engineering team was reporting they could not immediately counteract. Above him, 18 warships waited. The operation had achieved approximately 60% of its economic extraction objectives, which was below the minimum threshold for mission success under his operational parameters, but which was considerably better than 0%, which was what he would achieve if he remained in place long enough for those warships to decide that the ground situation required direct intervention. He was, professionally speaking, in the position of someone who had reached into a container expecting to retrieve a known quantity and had instead found something that had rearranged itself around his hand. He issued the recall order at 0941 hours, local colony time. The Vorkai withdrawal from Kepler's Hope was conducted with the same methodical efficiency as the original assault, which was to say it was fast, organized, and left very little behind. They took their wounded and their equipment and they departed through the same access points they had created 11 days earlier with the compressed urgency of a force that has correctly assessed that the window for safe withdrawal is closing. Reyes tracked their movement through the internal sensor network, monitoring without engaging, providing real-time positional updates to Captain Adler aboard the Resolute, who had 2 Sabre 4 fighter wings and atmospheric approach ready to respond if the withdrawal became something other than a withdrawal. It remained a withdrawal. The last Vorkai ground unit departed Kepler's Hope at 1023 hours, retreating to their remaining dropships and ascending toward a rendezvous point that the UED fleet had specifically, and deliberately, left open. Adler's decision to allow the Vorkai fleet to withdraw without engagement was later questioned by 3 members of the UED Defense Council and defended by every military officer who had been in the engagement. His reasoning was straightforward and he stated it in exactly the same precise, clear terms he used for everything else. The objective was the safety and liberation of 11,000 civilians. That objective was achieved. A secondary engagement with withdrawing forces would risk those civilians, risk his own crews, and transform what was currently an unambiguous demonstration of human military capability into a battle with unpredictable variables. The Vorkai had been shown what humanity could bring to bear. They had made their calculation and withdrawn. What they carried home with them was the knowledge of what 18 human warships looked like and the understanding of what had happened when a species that had presumably seemed manageable had answered an attack on one of its small, unimportant colonies with a response of that scale. That knowledge, Adler had said in his mission report, was worth more than the destruction of 4 Vorkai vessels. Because the message that knowledge carried was not simply humanity as warships. The message it carried was considerably more fundamental and considerably more consequential than that. The message was, this is what we send for 11,000 people on a moon you had probably never heard of before you decided to attack it. Governor Elaine Marsh emerged from the tunnel shelter access point at 1047 hours into the orange light of a Kepler's Hope morning that smelled of cold air and mineral dust and, distantly, the acrid tang of weapons discharge that had not yet cleared from the colony's ventilation systems. She stood at the surface level for a moment and looked at the damaged infrastructure around her, at the holes punched through the outer shell, at the darkened sections where power had not yet been fully restored, at the debris of a colony that had been systematically stripped and fought over for 11 days, and she felt something that was complex and not entirely nameable, a mixture of grief and fury and profound, bone-deep relief that was not yet fully real because the body does not immediately trust the ending of something that has been this total and this frightening. Then she looked up, through the orange sky, at the silhouettes of 3 UED vessels that had descended to low orbital altitude, their hulls visible as long, bright shapes catching the light of Kepler 442b's sun, and the complexity resolved itself into something simpler and more fundamental. They had come. When her people needed them, they had come, and they had come in such overwhelming, unambiguous force that the message required no translation into any language spoken anywhere in explored space. Commander Reyes came up through the access point behind her, followed by Yamamoto and the rest of the tunnel population in a stream that became a river as the emergency shelters began releasing their people back to the surface, thousands of men and women and children moving into the orange morning light with the stunned, blinking quality of those who have spent a long time underground and are relearning the existence of sky. The children were the first to find their voices. They always are. Small humans have a remarkable capacity to locate the ordinary in the extraordinary, and within 15 minutes of the surface access being declared clear, there were children running in the corridors near the airlocks and making noise at a volume that suggested they had a great deal of accumulated energy to release. A medevac shuttle from the Resolute grounded on the colony's secondary landing pad at 1112 hours, carrying medical personnel and supplies in quantities that suggested someone aboard that ship had done careful preparatory work during the transit, and the colony's 2 doctors met it with the particular relief of professionals who have been operating at the outer edge of their resources and have been waiting for exactly this specific kind of help. A second shuttle followed, carrying engineering assessment teams and emergency infrastructure components. A third carried Captain Adler himself, which was not standard procedure for a commanding officer of a heavy cruiser and which several members of his staff had quietly noted as technically being against protocol, and which Adler had addressed by the simple expedient of not asking for anyone's opinion about it. He was a compact, precise man in his early 50s, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something angular and calm by decades of responsibility, and he walked through the damaged corridors of Kepler's Hope beside Governor Marsh with an expression that took in the evidence of what had been done to this place with a quietness that was more eloquent than outrage would have been. He asked her specific, practical questions about the condition of the colonists and the status of the infrastructure, and he gave her specific, practical answers about the resources the fleet had brought and the timeline for additional support. He was, she thought, watching him, exactly the kind of person you want to see arriving at the end of a crisis, someone who is already thinking about what comes next. Near the colony's damaged central hub, they passed a wall where someone had written something during the 11 days of occupation, written it in large letters with the kind of marker used to label equipment crates, so that it would be seen by anyone moving through that corridor. Marsh had known it was there. She had been told about it on the 4th day, written by someone who had never been identified, and she had given the specific instruction that it was not to be removed or covered over. Adler stopped when he saw it, and read it, and was quiet for a moment. It said, in letters that had been pressed hard into the wall surface with the conviction of someone who needed to say something important and had chosen the most permanent method available to them, "We are still here." "Yes," Captain Adler said, quietly, to no one in particular. "You are." 3 months later, the UED Defense Council formally elevated the Vorkai to Category 1 status, which meant something very specific and very different from what Category 3 had meant. It meant that the slow, careful machinery of human diplomatic and military response had processed the information it had received and had arrived at a series of conclusions that would reshape the political and military posture of humanity's expansion across explored space for the foreseeable future. It meant new ships, and new weapons, and new defensive installations at every colony above a certain population threshold, and it meant a diplomatic communication delivered to the Vorkai through the 3 intermediary species who had contact with both civilizations, a communication that was notable for the precision of its language and the completeness of its intentions. It also meant something less formal but considerably more significant, which was a shift in the awareness of every human being in explored space, from the children of Kepler's Hope who had been underground for 11 days and had come back to the surface to find their colony damaged but their sky full of friendly ships, to the miners and farmers and engineers and administrators of 100 small settlements on 100 distant moons who had watched the events on Kepler's Hope through news broadcasts and had reached their own conclusions about what it meant. It meant the awareness, settling into the collective understanding of a species that had always been scrappy and determined and deeply reluctant to accept the idea that any situation was unwinnable, that they were not alone out here in the way that loneliness truly means. That someone would come. That something would answer. That you could attack a small colony on an unimportant moon 11,000 people called home, but you could not do it without consequences that would demonstrate, with a clarity that required no further elaboration, precisely what it means to be at war with humanity. In the rebuilt library of Kepler's Hope, which reopened 7 months after the attack with new shelving in a dedicated section for the children who had been born during or immediately after the crisis, there was a framed photograph on the wall near the entrance. It showed the orange sky above the colony on the morning of liberation, with 3 UED cruisers visible as bright shapes in the upper atmosphere, taken by a 12-year-old girl named Soo-Yun Park who had kept a small camera in her pocket throughout 11 days in the tunnels because her mother had told her to document things, that documentation mattered, that the truth of what happened to people deserved to be recorded. Below the photograph, on a small card, she had written the caption herself, in the handwriting of a 12-year-old who had been underground for 11 days and had come back to the surface to see the sky. "They came for us," it read. "They always come." End.